Poor mountain man inherits abandoned cave and old dog until the dog dug up a $5 million secret. Dust swirls in the empty street as a weary drifter takes the rope of a half-blind hound. The sheriff laughs, is nothing but a hollow cave in the high country, and this broken old dog. But when night falls, the hound's claws strike iron. From the darkness, a rusted box rises stuffed with a fortune so great it could buy the whole town. $5 million in gold and bonds. Whispers spread like wildfire. A greedy fans the flames. Soldiers march. A Cherokee widow steps forward with a deed older than the town itself, and the man who thought he had nothing is suddenly trapped between riches, law, and blood. The church bell tolls, the dog growls low, and every hand in Silver Bluff reaches for the treasure. But is this fortune a blessing from God or a curse meant to tear him apart? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Silver Bluff as Michael Boone pushed through the creaking door of the courthouse. His worn boots scraped against the wooden floor, drawing curious glances from the handful of townsfolk gathered inside. The clerk's spectacles caught the light as he peered down at the wrinkled paper in his hands. Let's see here. Inheritance. Of one James Boone, deceased, to his cousin Michael Boone. The clerk cleared his throat. Property consists of a cave located in the north ridge of Morgan's Peak, and one hunting hound answers to Rufus. A muffled snicker rippled through the onlookers. Michael's shoulders stiffened, but he kept his eyes fixed straight ahead. 20 years of trapping and scouting had taught him to weather worse than townspeople's scorn. Sheriff Amos Taylor stepped forward, his boots clicking against the floorboards. Despite his pronounced limp, he carried himself with quiet authority. "Cave's about 3 miles up the mountain trail," he said, his voice neither mocking nor particularly sympathetic. "Dog's been staying at the livery stable since your cousin passed." "Much obliged," Michael said quietly. The word felt strange in his mouth after so many months of speaking to no one but himself. At the stable, he found Rufus curled in a corner of a musty stall. The old hound raised his head, revealing a scarred muzzle and one clouded eye. His tail thumped weakly against the straw. "Come on then," Michael said, fastening a length of rope around the dog's neck. Rufus rose stiffly, but followed without resistance. The climb up Morgan's Peak was steep, the narrow trail winding between scrub oak and loose shale. Michael's legs burned from the ascent, and his empty stomach cramped with hunger. The meager coins in his pocket wouldn't stretch far in Silver Bluff's general store. He'd have to hunt soon. If there was any game worth finding in these picked-over hills, Rufus limped alongside him, stopping occasionally to rest, but always pushing on when Michael tugged the rope. The dog's determination stirred something in Michael's chest, a dim memory of his mother speaking about perseverance and faith. He pushed the thought away. Faith hadn't filled his belly or kept him warm these past hard years. The sun was setting by the time they reached the cave mouth, a dark opening in the granite face of the mountain. Michael gathered wood and kindled a small fire, its flames casting dancing shadows on the rock walls. The cave was dry at least, with enough room to stretch out. Better than some places he'd slept. From his pack, he pulled out a hard crust of bread, his last food. Breaking it in half, he offered a piece to Rufus. The old dog took it gently from his fingers. "Quite a pair we make," Michael said, his voice rough from disuse to broken-down strays with nowhere else to go. Rufus inched closer until his warm bulk pressed against Michael's leg. The simple contact eased something in Michael's chest. Though he couldn't have said why, the stars emerged one by one above the mountain, their cold light filtering down through the pine branches. Michael added another stick to the fire and pulled his thin blanket tighter. What sort of joke was this inheritance? A worthless cave and a half-blind dog? Was this God's idea of an answer to his prayers? He'd stopped believing in answers long ago, when his mother's faith failed to save her from the fever that took her. Since then, he'd learned to rely on himself alone. But tonight, with Rufus's steady breathing beside him and the fire's warmth holding back the darkness, Michael felt the first stirring of something he hadn't known in years, a sense that perhaps he wasn't entirely alone. The night wind whispered through the pines, carrying the lonely cry of a distant coyote. Michael settled back against his saddle, one hand resting on Rufus's graying head. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges: food to find, shelter to improve, a life to somehow piece together from these strange beginnings. But for now, he had a roof over his head, however rough, and a companion who asked nothing of him but presence. "Reckon we'll make do," he murmured to the dog. Rufus's tail thumped once against the cave floor in quiet agreement. The fire crackled softly as Michael stared into its depths, wondering what his cousin had seen in this place that made him think it worth passing on. There must have been something, more than just an empty cave and an old dog. But those answers, if they existed, would have to wait for morning. For now, there was only the fire's warmth, the dog's companionship, and the vast silence of the mountain night wrapping around them. Both morning light crept into the cave mouth, painting the rough stone walls with pale gold. As Michael stirred from his uncomfortable sleep against the saddle, his bones aching from the hard ground. Beside him, Rufus lifted his graying head, his good eye watching as Michael stretched and rose. "Well, might as well see what we've got here," Michael said, his voice echoing slightly in the cave's depths. The cave extended about 30 feet back into the mountain, wider at the mouth and narrowing toward the rear. As Michael's eyes adjusted to the dimness, details emerged from the shadows. Old ashes marked the floor where previous fires had burned, black circles against the stone. Scattered about were the abandoned leavings of earlier occupants, a broken hammer handle, rusty nails, and the remains of what might have been a wooden crate. Along the walls, pale streaks of mineral deposits caught the light. Michael ran his hand over them, feeling the rough texture beneath his fingers. Some were white as bone, others tinted with rust red or dull yellow. He'd seen enough mines in his travels to recognize iron and quartz, though he knew little about their value. "Reckon this explains why Cousin James claimed this place," he muttered. Rufus huffed in response, limping carefully around the cave's perimeter, his nose working busily at every corner and crevice. The floor was littered with years of debris, dead leaves, twigs, and dirt blown in by countless winds. Michael found a broken tree branch that would serve as a crude broom and began sweeping, working methodically from back to front. The physical labor felt good after yesterday's long journey, giving purpose to his movements. "Ain't much," he said to Rufus, "but it'll do better once it's cleaned proper." The old dog watched from his chosen spot near the entrance, head tilted, as though considering Michael's efforts. When Michael paused to wipe sweat from his forehead, Rufus struggled to his feet and disappeared into the scrub oak outside. He returned a few minutes later, dragging a small pine branch. Michael couldn't help but smile. "That's right, helpful of you," he said, taking the branch. "These'll make for softer bedding than bare stone." Following Rufus's example, Michael spent the next hour gathering pine boughs, laying them in a thick mat along one wall of the cave. The fresh pine scent filled the space, making it feel less abandoned. He arranged his few possessions, saddle, blanket, the nearly empty pack atop the makeshift bed. By afternoon, his throat was dry with dust. "Time to find water," he told Rufus. Taking an old bucket he'd found among the debris, Michael followed, a game trail that wound down the mountainside. The sound of running water led him to a clear stream about a quarter-mile from the cave. The climb back up with the full bucket was harder, water sloshing over his boots, but the effort would be worth it. Without having to make this trek twice a day, they'd never survive up here. Rufus met him at the cave mouth, tail wagging despite his obvious stiffness as evening approached. Michael built a small fire just inside the entrance where the smoke could escape. He'd found a piece of pine wood earlier, dense and straight-grained, perfect for carving. Settling back against the cave wall, he began shaping it with his knife, working slowly and carefully in the firelight. "You know, Rufus," he said, testing the weight of the half-formed spoon in his hand, "I can't help feeling foolish. Talking to a dog like you was a man." He paused to study his work, smoothing a rough spot with his thumb. "But I reckon after so many years of keeping my own company, it's good to have someone else around, even if you ain't much for conversation." Rufus lifted his head from his paws, regarding Michael with his one good eye. The firelight caught the scars on his muzzle, testament to old battles survived. The wind picked up as night deepened, carrying the first real bite of mountain cold. Michael added more wood to the fire, watching the sparks spiral up into the darkness. The cave caught the warmth, holding it like a cupped hand. For the first time since receiving news of his inheritance, he felt something other than bitterness or resignation. This was no fine house or prosperous farm, but it was shelter. The dog was no family, but his steady presence eased the ache of solitude that had been Michael's constant companion these past years. Here, in this rough cave with its mineral-streaked walls and pine-scented floor, he felt the first tentative roots of belonging begin to take hold. Rufus shifted closer to the fire, pressing against Michael's leg, as he often did. Michael set aside his carving and rested one hand on the dog's scarred head. Together, they watched the flames dance, while outside, the wind sang through the pines and the stars wheeled slowly overhead. 3 days passed in a blur of constant work. Michael's muscles ached from dawn to dusk as he transformed the cave into something more like a home. The steady rhythm of his axe echoed through the mountain air as he chopped fallen pine and oak for firewood, stacking the split logs carefully near the cave's entrance. The roof needed attention where water seeped through cracks in the rock. Michael gathered strips of thick pine bark, overlapping them like shingles to direct the water away from his sleeping area. His hands grew rough and sticky with sap, but the patches held when he tested them with water from his bucket. "What do you think of that, Rufus?" he asked, watching droplets roll harmlessly down the makeshift channels. The old dog wagged his tail, having appointed himself supervisor of all Michael's projects along the cave walls. Michael installed crude shelves, using fallen branches and flat stones. These he secured with a mixture of clay from the stream bank and smaller stones, creating spaces to store his meager supplies off the ground. It wasn't pretty work, but it was solid. "Not exactly fine carpentry," he muttered, testing the strength of a shelf with his hand, "but it'll serve." The fourth night settled in cold and clear. Michael had just finished his evening meal of beans and bacon when Rufus's behavior changed. The old dog had been dozing by the fire, but suddenly lifted his head, nose twitching. Before Michael could speak, Rufus struggled to his feet and limped purposefully toward the back of the cave. "What's got into you?" Michael asked, watching as Rufus began scratching at the packed earth floor with unexpected vigor. "Here now, stop that, you'll hurt your paws." But Rufus ignored him, digging with desperate intensity. Michael raised his lantern, the light catching dust motes stirred up by the dog's efforts. He was about to pull Rufus away when he heard it. A distinct metallic clang as the dog's claws struck something solid. "Hold on there, boy!" He brushed away loose dirt with his hands, and his fingers met cold iron. His heart began to pound. Working together now, man and dog cleared the earth until the object was fully revealed. A strongbox about 2 feet long, its surface thick. With rust, a corroded padlock held the lid secure, but the metal was so degraded that Michael knew his hatchet would make quick work of it. "Stand back," he told Rufus, positioning the hatchet's blade against the lock's hasp. One sharp blow shattered the weakened metal. With trembling hands, Michael lifted the lid. The lantern light fell across neat bundles of paper money, their edges yellow with age but still crisp. Beside them lay several folders containing what appeared to be gold certificates, and beneath, those government bonds with dates from 30 years past. Michael's hands shook as he lifted out the first bundle of bills, running his thumb across their edges. "Sweet Lord above," he whispered. He had never seen so much money in one place. The numbers printed on the bonds made his head spin. This was more wealth than he had earned in his entire life of trapping and scouting. Rufus pressed against his side, nose twitching at the musty smell of old paper. Michael wrapped one arm around the dog's scarred shoulders, needing something solid to hold on to as his world tilted beneath him. "You knew, didn't you?" he said hoarsely. "All this time, you knew what was hidden here." The dog's tail thumped against the cave floor, his one good eye bright in the lantern light. Through the long hours until dawn, Michael counted and recounted the fortune. When the first pale light crept into the cave mouth, he had managed a rough tally close to $5 million in various forms of currency and securities. The amount was so vast it felt unreal, like something from a fairy tale rather than his own hard life. He sat back against the cave wall, watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky in pink and gold. Rufus dozed beside him, worn out from his night's work. The strongbox sat open between them, its contents catching the morning light. "What am I supposed to do with all this?" Michael asked softly. His whole life had been shaped by scarcity. the need to work for every meal, every piece of clothing, every bullet for his rifle. Now, with one dig of a dog's paws, everything had changed. The morning breeze carried the scent of pine and sage into the cave, familiar and grounding. Michael looked around at his 3 days' work, the stacked firewood, the bark-patched roof, the rough shelves he'd built with such care. None of it seemed to matter now, yet somehow it mattered more than ever. This cave had been his inheritance, a joke to the townspeople below. But it had held a fortune all along, waiting for the right moment, the right person, and the right dog to uncover it. Rufus stirred in his sleep, paws twitching as he chased dream rabbits. Michael rested his hand on the dog's graying head, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, old friend," he whispered. "Thank you." Michael stared at the strongbox as dawn's first light crept into the cave. He hadn't slept, his mind racing with possibilities and fears. The fortune couldn't stay here, exposed in this mountain hideaway. It needed safekeeping. With careful hands, he wrapped the box in an old blanket and secured it to his mule's packsaddle. "Keep watch, Rufus," he said softly, checking the knots one final time. The old dog's tail wagged as he limped alongside. Them down the narrow trail, the morning sun had barely topped the eastern ridges when they reached Silver Bluff. The streets were quiet. Most shops still shuttered. Only the telegraph office showed signs of life, its operator dozing in his chair by the clicking machine. Michael led his mule toward the bank, hoping to arrive just as it opened. But as he passed the Silver Dollar Saloon, movement caught his eye. Hank Crowder stood in the doorway. Wiping glasses with a dirty rag, the saloon-keeper's sharp eyes fixed on the blanket-trapped bundle. "Morning, mountain man," Crowder called out, his voice oily with curiosity. "Quite a load you're carrying there. Just some supplies," Michael answered shortly, quickening his pace. He could feel Crowder's gaze boring into his back. The bank manager, Mr. Peterson, raised his eyebrows when Michael unwrapped the strongbox on his desk. "This is unexpected," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "We'll need to count it properly, of course, and there will be papers to sign." It took 2 hours to process everything. Michael's hands were sweating as he signed the final document. The manager assured him the fortune would be secure in the bank's vault, but something in the air had changed. Through the bank's front window, Michael noticed several townspeople walking past. Stealing glances inside. By noon, the whispers had started. Michael felt them as he walked to the general store for supplies. Rufus pressed closer to his leg, sensing his unease. Inside the store, conversation stopped when he entered, then resumed in hushed tones behind his back. He took a room at the Silver Bluff Hotel, knowing he couldn't leave his fortune unprotected in the cave overnight. The dining room was crowded for the evening meal. Michael sat in a corner, a bowl of beef stew growing cold before him. Rufus curled under the table, occasionally growling softly at passing feet that strayed too close. Strange faces appeared at the hotel. Men with hard eyes and dusty boots who lingered in the lobby, asking casual questions about local mines and hidden caves. A pair of gamblers from the Silver Dollar took the table next to Michael's, their conversation just loud enough to carry. "Heard it was army money," one said, shuffling cards. $5 million in payroll, vanished during the war. During the war. "That's so," his partner replied, eyeing Michael's back. "Mighty interesting thing to turn up after all these years." Michael pushed his stew away, appetite gone. He climbed the narrow stairs to his rented room, Rufus's nails clicking on the wooden steps behind him. Sleep came in fitful bursts, broken by creaking floorboards in the hallway and muffled voices through thin walls. Morning brought no relief. Michael was drinking bitter coffee in the hotel restaurant when bootsteps echoed across the wooden floor. A tall man in a crisp government uniform approached his table, brass buttons gleaming. A marshal's star caught the light. "Mr. Boone." The man's voice carried the weight of authority. "I'm government agent Samuel Riker. We need to discuss that strongbox you deposited yesterday." Michael set down his coffee cup carefully. "Do we?" $5 million is a significant sum to appear out of nowhere. Riker pulled out a chair uninvited, particularly when it matches the exact amount stolen from an Army payroll wagon in 1863. Those funds were never recovered. The agent's eyes were cold as he studied Michael's face. "The government takes a very serious view of stolen property, Mr. Boone. Even after all these years, Michael met his gaze steadily, but said nothing. Under the table, Rufus pressed against his boots, a low rumble building in the old dog's chest. Riker stood, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve. "I'll be conducting a formal investigation. I suggest you make yourself available for questioning." He paused, adding quietly, "And I strongly advise against attempting to withdraw those funds." The agent's boot heels struck the floor like hammer blows as he walked away. Around the dining room, every eye turned quickly back to plates and coffee cups, but Michael could feel the weight of their sideways glances. His blessing had become a curse. In the space of 2 days, his inheritance had transformed from a joke into something dangerous. The cave above town suddenly seemed like a safer haven than this hotel full of watching eyes and whispered rumors. Rufus whined softly, resting his graying muzzle on Michael's knee. "I know, old friend," Michael murmured, scratching behind the dog's scarred ears. "I reckon we've stirred up more than we bargained for." The Silver Bluff Courthouse, really just the largest room in the town hall, buzzed with whispers as Michael took his seat at the rough wooden table. Morning sun streamed through dusty windows, catching motes of dust that danced in the air. Sheriff Taylor stood near the door, his weathered face creased with concern. "This here's just an informal hearing," the sheriff announced, tapping his cane against the floor for quiet. "We aim to sort out rightful ownership of certain properties and items recently discovered." Government Agent Riker sat at the opposite table, his uniform crisp despite the summer heat. He arranged papers before him with precise movements, like a card player laying out his winning hand. "The United States Army," Riker began, his voice carrying to every corner, "has documented evidence that $5 million in military funds disappeared in this region during the Civil War. The amount matches exactly what Mr. Boone claims to have found." Michael's jaw tightened. He hadn't actually claimed anything the town's gossips had done that worked for him. "We require proof of legitimate ownership," Riker continued, "both of the cave and its contents. Without such proof, these funds must be considered stolen government property." Before Michael could speak, movement near the back door caught everyone's attention. A woman entered, her steps quiet but purposeful. She wore a simple, dark dress, her black hair touched with silver at the temples. Though her skin was darker than most in the room, she held herself with quiet dignity. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "Cherokee woman," someone muttered, "Mary Two Heart's widow." She approached the front, pulling a folded paper from a beaded leather pouch. Michael noticed her hands were steady as she smoothed the document on the table. "I have here," she said in clear English, "a deed to that cave and the surrounding land. It belonged to my late husband's people before the treaties, and was formally granted to his grandfather by the territorial governor." The paper she displayed was yellowed with age, written in careful English script. Beside the official seal was a tribal mark in deep red ink. Sheriff Taylor limped forward to examine it, adjusting his spectacles. Riker's face darkened. "This is highly irregular. These tribal claims rarely hold up to proper legal scrutiny." From the gallery came sneers and dismissive laughs. "Injun deed ain't worth the paper it's written on," someone called out. Michael's hands clenched into fists under the table. He'd seen that kind of prejudice before, but something about the woman's quiet strength in the face of it stirred his anger. "The deed appears genuine," Sheriff Taylor said slowly. "Dates back to 1842, near as I can make out." "That cave was sacred to my husband's people," Mary continued, her voice steady despite the hostile murmurs. "They sheltered there in hard winters and held ceremonies in its depths. The land remembers, even if some men choose to forget." Michael found himself studying her face. There was no trace of fear in her dark eyes, only certainty and perhaps a touch of sadness. She stood like someone used to standing alone. Riker shuffled his papers impatiently. "None of this addresses the matter of the funds. Even if this deed were valid, it wouldn't convey ownership of property clearly stolen from the United States government. This hearing will reassess," Sheriff Taylor announced, rapping his cane again for order. "I need time to review these claims proper-like, but I'm warning all parties unless clear proof of rightful ownership emerges. The Army may have no choice but to seize both cave and contents." The crowd began to disperse, their buzzing conversations filling the room. Michael rose slowly, his thoughts tangled. The woman, Mary, was already moving toward the door. Her deed carefully returned to its pouch. As she passed his table, her eyes met his briefly. There was something in that glance, not a challenge, exactly, but an acknowledgement. They were both outsiders here, in their own ways. That evening, Michael climbed back to his cave, Rufus limping faithfully beside him. The setting sun painted the cliffs gold and purple, but he barely noticed the beauty. Mary's words echoed in his mind, "The land remembers." He built a small fire at the cave's mouth and sat watching the flames dance. Rufus settled beside him with a contented sigh, his graying muzzle resting on Michael's boot. The night wind whispered through the pines, carrying the faint scent of sage in town. They'd sneered at her heritage, dismissed her claim with casual cruelty, yet she'd faced them all with a dignity that put their prejudice to shame. Michael found himself wondering what other stories these stone walls might hold, what ceremonies had echoed here in winters long past. For 3 days, Michael paced the cave like a caged mountain lion. The strongbox weighed on his mind heavier than any physical burden he'd ever carried. Each morning, he checked its hiding spot beneath the stone shelf he'd built, making sure it remained untouched. Each night, he lay awake, wondering if thieves might come. Rufus seemed to sense his unease. The old dog watched him with his good eye, head tilted in that knowing way dogs have. On the 4th morning, while Michael was gathering firewood, Rufus suddenly lifted his nose to the wind and limped off down the mountain path with surprising speed. "Rufus, get back here," Michael called, but the dog paid him no mind. Muttering under his breath, Michael followed the trail of broken twigs and disturbed leaves. The path wound down into a sheltered valley where a small creek bubbled over rocks. There, nestled against a stand of cottonwoods, he spotted a wagon camp. Smoke rose from a morning cooking fire, and children's voices carried on the breeze. Rufus had already made himself at home, sprawled in the dust while small hands patted his gray coat. 3 Cherokee children, none older than 10 years, giggled. As the old dog rolled over for belly rubs, Mary stood at the fire, watching them with a gentle smile that transformed her serious face. She looked up as Michael approached, her expression growing guarded. "Your dog seems to have found us." "Sorry about that," Michael said, suddenly conscious of his ragged coat and untrimmed beard. "He ain't usually so social." "Dogs know good hearts," Mary said, stirring something in an iron pot. The smell of cornbread baking in the coals made Michael's stomach growl. "These little ones lost their parents to fever last winter. I do what I can for them." Michael watched as she broke off pieces of cornbread, making sure each child got an equal share. There wasn't much to go around, but none of the children complained. They ate with the quiet dignity he'd seen in their guardian, thanking her in soft Cherokee words. The sight stirred something in Michael's chest, memories of his own mother sharing their last crust of bread during hard times, telling him to trust in God's provision. He thought of the fortune hidden in his cave, enough to feed hundreds of hungry children. "The cave," he said suddenly, "it's big enough for several families. You could shelter there when the weather turns. Mary's dark eyes studied him, weighing his words. "Why offer this now?" "Seems right," Michael said simply. He didn't mention the strongbox. That truth wasn't ready to be spoken yet. Winter's coming. No sense in both of us claiming the same shelter. When we could share it. One of the smaller girls had curled up against Rufus, her small hand tangled in his fur. "I accept," Mary said finally, "though I suspect there's more to your change of heart than simple charity." Michael met her gaze steadily. "Maybe so, but the offer's honest enough." As evening approached, Mary set about preparing a venison stew, adding wild onions and herbs the children had gathered. Michael contributed some coffee from his supplies, and they shared the meal as stars began pricking through the darkening sky. The children told stories, in mixed Cherokee and English, acting out tales of clever rabbits and foolish wolves, while Rufus watched with his head cocked. Their laughter echoed off the valley walls, free and unrestrained. Mary spoke quietly of her late husband, of his dreams for their people's future. "He believed in building bridges," she said, stirring the fire. "Between old ways and new, between all who share this land. Sometimes I wonder if I'm strong enough to carry that dream forward alone." Michael thought about the fortune that could build more than bridges. It could build schools. By land, ensure no child went hungry. The money had felt like a burden before, But now he began to see it differently. Maybe it wasn't just his inheritance, but a trust meant for something larger than himself. The night deepened, and the children curled up in blankets near the fire. Rufus settled himself between Michael and Mary, his old bones creaking as he lay down. Above them, the Milky Way stretched like a river of light across the black sky. "Thank you," Mary said softly, "for sharing our fire tonight." Michael nodded, words feeling inadequate. For the first time since finding the strongbox, his heart felt truly at peace. Whatever came next, he was no longer walking this path alone. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and unchanging, witnessing the quiet beginning of something new. The first rays of dawn found Michael at the bank in Silver Bluff, exchanging a $100 bond for smaller bills. His hands trembled slightly as he tucked the money into his coat pocket. Outside, he paused on the wooden sidewalk, watching Thomas Wheeler, a local farmer, argue with the bank manager through the window. That afternoon, Michael overheard Wheeler's story at the general store. The man was 3 payments behind on his equipment loan. His crops withered from drought. When Wheeler stepped out to load his meager purchases, Michael quietly settled the farmer's debt, leaving strict instructions that the payment be marked as administrative correction. 2 days later, Wheeler stood in church, tears streaming down, his weathered face as he testified about the mysterious clearing of his debt. Michael kept his eyes fixed on his worn boot toes, warmth spreading through his chest. The old church itself bore witness to years of neglect. Its roof leaked badly, forcing congregants to shuffle between dry spots during rainstorms. Michael approached Deacon Harris with an offer to fund repairs, claiming he'd saved the money from odd jobs. Though skeptical, the deacon accepted the gift of lumber and shingles. Word spread through Silver Bluff about the strange turn of events. Some folks whispered that Michael must be winning at cards, though no one had seen him near the saloon tables. Others suggested he'd struck a secret silver vein in his cave, but as the weeks passed, Michael's quiet pattern of giving began to shift opinions. He worked alongside the other men to repair the church roof, his shoulders burning under the hot sun. Mary brought water to the workers, her dark eyes meeting his with knowing warmth. The children from her camp played in the churchyard, their laughter mixing with the rhythm of hammers. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," she said, passing him a tin cup. "Some might call it providence." Michael wiped his brow, thinking of the strongbox hidden in the cave. "Reckon so," he mumbled. Every few days, he made his way to the agency school where many Cherokee children studied. The teacher, Miss Bennett, would find sacks of flour, beans, and sugar on the kitchen steps. Once, she caught Michael making a delivery at dawn. "You're a good man, Mr. Boone," she said simply, helping him carry in the provisions. "These children never know if they'll eat supper. Now they do." Michael nodded awkwardly, unused to praise. "Just passing along what's been given to me." The next Sunday, Reverend Matthews preached about the widow's mite and anonymous giving, and some among us have shown true Christian charity. Michael bowed his head, remembering his mother's worn Bible about generosity. The memories no longer stung as they once had. Instead, they felt like guidance, showing him the way forward. Rufus lay contentedly at Mary's feet, surrounded by her charges. The children had taken to saving bits of their biscuits for the old dog, who accepted their offerings with gentle dignity. Michael watched as one small girl wrapped her arms around Rufus's neck, whispering secrets in his good ear. After the service, folks who had once hurried past now stopped to shake Michael's hand. Wheeler clapped him on the shoulder with tears still in his eyes. Even the sheriff offered a respectful nod. The setting sun painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold. People are remembering how to care for one another. "Ain't nothing special," Michael protested. "Just trying to do what's right." "That's exactly what makes it special," she replied. Their voices echoed off the rocks, singing hymns mixed with Cherokee songs. The old dog barked joyfully, as if adding his own praise to their chorus. Michael felt something shift inside him, like ice breaking up in spring. The fortune no longer weighed him down with worry. Instead, it had become a tool for healing, not just his own wounded spirit, but the hurts of an entire community. Each act of giving loosened the knots of loneliness that had bound him for so long. The cave was no longer just shelter, but a symbol of possibility. and Mary's steady presence reminded him daily that no one was meant to walk alone. That evening, as the children gathered for prayers around Mary's fire, Michael bowed his head. With them, the words came back to him, remembered from childhood. "Give us this day our daily bread." He understood now what his mother had tried to teach him, that true wealth lay not in what was kept, but in what was shared. Rufus settled between them, his gray muzzle resting on Michael's knee. Above, the first stars emerged, bright as silver coins scattered across heaven's vault. But Michael had found a richness far greater than silver or gold. He had found his place among these people, this makeshift family. Each passing day, the warm May evening wrapped Silver Bluff in golden light as wedding bells rang from the white-painted church. Michael adjusted his borrowed suit collar, feeling out of place among the townspeople streaming through the doors. "Reckon we should sit near the back," Michael murmured, noting the sideways glances from some of the guests. But Mary held her head high. The small church glowed with lamplight, paper flowers, and ribbon streamers adorning every window. Michael recognized his own lumber in the fresh-laid floorboards beneath their feet, and something like pride warmed his chest. Young Sarah Miller, the bride, floated down the aisle in white muslin and lace, her face shining with joy. Her groom, Thomas Wheeler's eldest son James, waited at the altar with nervous happiness. Michael remembered helping clear the Wheeler family's debt just weeks ago. Now here was their boy, starting a new life with his sweetheart. The pastor's words filled the church with ancient promise. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Michael found himself stealing glances at Mary beside him. Her dark eyes were fixed on the couple, a gentle smile playing at her lips. The lamplight caught the silver threads in her black hair. And something stirred in Michael's heart, a longing he thought he'd buried years ago. When the couple kissed, the congregation erupted in cheers and happy tears. Mary dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Young love," she whispered. "It gives hope to us all." The celebration spilled out onto the church lawn as darkness fell. Lanterns hung from tree branches, casting warm circles of light over tables laden with food. Someone struck up a fiddle tune, and couples began to dance. Michael and Mary found a quiet spot at the edge of the gathering. They shared slices of wedding cake from tin plates, watching the joyful chaos. The bride and groom whirled past, lost in their own world of happiness. "Remember when you first came to town?" Mary asked softly. "All alone with just Rufus and a cave to your name." Michael nodded, thinking how much had changed. "Never thought I'd be welcome at something like this." "You've earned their respect," she said, "by choosing to be generous when you could have been bitter." They sat in comfortable silence as the music played on. The night air carried the scent of wild roses and Mary's subtle fragrance of sage and sweetgrass. Michael felt the weight of unspoken words between them. As if reading his thoughts, Mary turned to him. "Even caves can become homes when filled with love," she said quietly. Her words held deeper meaning than just the simple truth of them. Michael's heart quickened. He wanted to reach for her hand, but held back, uncertain. Instead, he watched young Sarah Wheeler dancing with her father, remembered his own mother's dreams for him, a good woman, a family, a life of purpose. When the last dance ended and the lanterns began to dim, Michael and Mary started the walk home. Rufus padded faithfully beside them, his graying muzzle lifted to scent the night air. The moon hung low and golden over the mountains, lighting their path. They walked slowly, neither wanting the evening to end. The town fell away behind them, replaced by the whisper of pine trees and the distant cry of a whippoorwill. Mary's shawl slipped, and Michael caught it, carefully draping it back around her shoulders. His fingers brushed her skin, sending a current through him. "Thank you," she murmured. And he knew she meant more than just the shawl. The cave entrance appeared ahead, a darker shadow against the night, but it no longer seemed a place of lonely exile. Light spilled from inside. Mary's children had left a lantern burning to guide them home. Home, the word echoed in Michael's mind with new meaning. They paused at the fork in the path, where Mary would turn toward her wagon camp. Rufus sat between them, looking from one to the other with his one good eye, as if waiting for something important. "It was a beautiful wedding," Mary said softly. "Yes," Michael replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Beautiful," the night wrapped. Around them, like a blanket full of peace and possibility. Hope bloomed strong in Michael's chest. Hope for more evenings like this, more shared smiles, more quiet understanding. Perhaps even love, growing as naturally as wildflowers after spring rain. "Good night, Michael," Mary said at last, touching his arm gently before turning away. "Good night," he answered, watching until she disappeared into the darkness. Rufus leaned against his leg, offering silent companionship. Together, man and dog climbed the path to their cave, the lantern's glow beckoning them home. The stars wheeled. Overhead, ancient and bright witnesses to the tender beginnings of something new and precious taking root in the rocky soil of their lives. The morning dawned clear and crisp, with no hint of the storm about to break. Michael stood outside the general store, loading supplies onto his mule when the first hoofbeats echoed down Silver Bluff's Main Street. A dozen soldiers in blue uniforms rode in tight formation, their rifles gleaming in the sunlight. Government. Agent Samuel Riker led them, his face set in grim lines. People stopped in their tracks, conversations dying mid. A mother hurried her children inside the mercantile. The blacksmith's hammer fell silent. Michael's hand instinctively went to his belt, but he carried no weapon. Rufus growled low beside him, hackles rising. The soldiers spread out in a half circle, their horses' hooves kicking up dust on the packed earth. "Michael Boone," Riker called out, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet street. "You are under arrest for the possession of stolen federal property." Michael's throat went dry. What stolen property? $5 million in United States Army payroll funds taken during the war. Riker dismounted, spurs jingling. "Along with associated bonds and certificates found in your possession." A gasp rippled through the gathering crowd. Michael saw faces he knew, the preacher, the Wheeler family, townspeople he'd helped, all watching with mixed expressions of shock and uncertainty. "That money was left to me," Michael said firmly. "It's my inheritance." A convenient story. Riker nodded to his men. "Secure the prisoner." Two soldiers approached, reaching for Michael's arms. Rufus lunged forward with a snarl, teeth bared. The nearest soldier swung his rifle but hard, catching the old dog in the ribs. Rufus crashed to the ground with a high-pitched yelp that tore at Michael's heart. "No!" Mary's voice rang out. She pushed through the crowd, her face flushed with anger. "You have no right. We have a legal deed to that cave, and everything in it." Riker turned his cold gaze on her. "Ah, yes, the supposed Cherokee claim." He pulled a paper from his coat. "This document states, 'Your deed is fraudulent, madam. You could be charged with attempting to defraud the federal government.'" Mary stood her ground, though Michael saw her. Hands trembling. "Worthless marks on paper," Riker sneered. "Unless you'd like to join Mr. Boone in jail, I suggest you step back." The soldiers grabbed Michael's arms, twisting them behind his back. Cold iron manacles snapped around his wrists. He wanted to fight, to break free, but the sight of rifles aimed at Mary stopped him cold. "The money box," Riker ordered. "Where is it, Michael?" Pressed his lips together, but a nervous shopkeeper pointed toward the bank. Riker dispatched men to retrieve it. Minutes later, they emerged carrying the iron strongbox, loading it onto a waiting wagon. Michael watched his inheritance, all his dreams of doing good, of building a life, disappear under an army tarp. Rufus whimpered from where he lay in the dust, trying to rise on trembling legs. Mary knelt beside the injured dog, tears streaming down her face. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, angry. Thomas Wheeler stepped forward. "Now wait just a minute. Michael's been helping folks around here. That money's been doing good." "Stand back," Riker warned, his hand on his pistol. "This is federal business." The soldiers marched Michael toward the jail, past faces he'd grown to know over these past weeks. Some turned away, others watched with a mixture of fear and outrage in their eyes. The preacher raised his hand as if to speak, then lowered it helplessly. Jail door clanged shut with terrible finality. The cell was small, dark save for a barred window high in the wall. Michael stood, gripping the iron bars, until the soldier's hoofbeats faded away. Then his legs gave out, and he sank onto the thin mattress. Hours crawled by. Through the window, he heard fragments of conversation, townspeople arguing about what had happened, about whether to believe Riker's accusations. Someone mentioned writing to the territorial governor. Another voice suggested getting a lawyer from the city. But all Michael could think about was Mary's face as the soldiers threatened her, and Rufus's cry of pain, his fists clenched until his nails bit into his palms. Where was God in all this? He'd tried to do right, to help others, to build something good. Now everything lay in ruins. Evening shadows crept across the cell floor. In the gathering dark, Michael's faith wavered like a candle flame in the wind. He thought of his mother's Bible teachings about trials and tribulation, but the words felt hollow now. All his hopes for a home, for Mary, for a life of purpose, seemed to mock him. From behind these iron bars, outside, a dog howled mournfully in the distance. Michael pressed his forehead against the cold stone wall and closed his eyes. Alone with his despair, the stone walls of Silver Bluff's jail held the night's chill like a tomb. Michael sat on the thin mattress, his shoulders pressed against rough-hewn rock, watching Dawn's pale fingers creep through the barred window. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Rufus crumpling under the rifle blow, heard Mary's voice breaking as she tried to defend their claim. The morning brought the clatter of tin cups and the guards' heavy boots. A plate of cold beans appeared through the slot, but Michael couldn't bring himself to touch it. The hours stretched like molasses in winter, marked only by the changing patterns of sunlight on the floor. Then came the whisper of skirts against stone, and a familiar shadow fell across his cell. Mary. He scrambled to his feet. She stood at the bars, her dark eyes bright with concern. The guard was nowhere to be seen. I slipped past while he took his noon meal, she explained softly. I couldn't leave you alone here. Michael's throat tightened. Even now, with everything lost, she risked herself to reach him. Her small hand slipped through the bars to grasp his calloused fingers. Despite the chill, her touch was warm. How is Rufus? The words came rough with worry. Alive, the blow cracked 2 ribs, but he's stronger than he looks. Mary's thumb traced circles on his palm. He disappeared into the hills this morning. I tried to keep him close, but you know how stubborn that old dog can be. Michael nodded, fighting back the sting in his eyes. At least Rufus was free, even if wounded. The whole town's talking, Mary continued. Many want to help, but they're scared of the soldiers. Thomas Wheeler rode out to fetch a lawyer from Carson City. It won't matter, Michael said bitterly. That agent has it all planned. The money, the cave, everything we built, gone like morning mist. Mary's grip tightened. Do you remember the scripture about storing up treasures in heaven, where moths and rust cannot destroy? Her voice carried the quiet strength he'd come to rely on. What you did with that money, helping families, rebuilding the church, feeding children, those are treasures that can't be taken away, not by soldiers or government men or anyone else. I tried to do right, Michael whispered. For once in my life, I thought I was following God's path. Now look where it's led. The path isn't finished yet. Mary pressed something small and cool into his palm, a smooth river stone marked with the Cherokee symbol for hope. Sometimes the darkest valley leads to the brightest summit. You taught me that, watching you change these past weeks. Boots echoed in the corridor. Mary withdrew her hand quickly. I have to go, but remember, you're not alone in this fight. She slipped away like a shadow, leaving Michael clutching the stone, its surface warming against his skin. Her words echoed in his mind as afternoon faded to evening, as the guard brought another meal he couldn't eat. As night crept back into his cell, in the darkness, Michael found himself on his knees, beside the thin mattress. The stone floor bit through his trousers, but he barely noticed, his hands clasped together, trembling slightly as words he hadn't spoken in years rose to his lips. Lord, he whispered, voice cracking, I ain't much for praying anymore. Not since Ma passed, but if you're listening, he paused, struggling. I need strength, not for myself, but for Mary, for those kids she cares for all the folks counting on that money to see them through winter. The words came easier now, like a dam breaking. I was lost for so long, living only for myself. Then you gave me Rufus and the cave, and his voice caught in Mary. Show me the way forward. Help me protect what matters, even from behind these bars. A cool breeze drifted through the window, carrying the distant cry of a coyote. Michael remained kneeling, the river stone clutched in his hand like an anchor. For the first time since the soldiers came, peace settled over him. Not the peace of safety or certainty, but the deeper peace of knowing he wasn't facing this trial alone. Far up in the shadowed hills, where sparse pines clung to rocky slopes, a familiar shape moved through the darkness. Pain flared with each step, but the faithful hound pressed on, drawn by some instinct toward the cave that had started everything. The night wrapped around him like a blanket as he disappeared into the shadows of the mountain. 3 days passed. Like molasses dripping from a winter jar, the town of Silver Bluff buzzed with whispered conversations and worried glances toward the jail where Michael Boone sat waiting. But up in the hills, something was stirring. Rufus, his ribs still tender from the soldier's blow, had been scratching and whining at the cave's back wall since dawn. The old dog's persistence caught the attention of Sarah Wheeler, who'd brought her husband's lunch to where he was cutting timber nearby. "That dog's trying to tell us something," she said, watching Rufus paw frantically at the stone. Just like when he found the strongbox, Thomas Wheeler wiped his brow and leaned on his axe. "Reckon we ought to fetch some folks. Could be important, considering everything that's happened." The sheriff stood watching, arms crossed, while 3 men worked with picks and shovels where Rufus indicated. The old hound wouldn't leave the spot, even when offered water and meat. "Look here," young Billy Peterson called out, his shovel striking something solid. "There's another box." This one was smaller than the strong box, made of tin and sealed tight against the dampness. The sheriff took it carefully, turning it over in his weathered hands. The lid creaked open, revealing a stack of yellowed papers bound with faded ribbon. "Letters," the sheriff said, squinting at the spidery handwriting. "And railroad contracts. These are official Union Pacific documents, dated 1872. They show Michael's cousin was hired as a paymaster during the railroad's expansion." He shuffled through more pages. "There's more formal agreements, signing over the payroll funds as payment for services rendered. All legal and proper, with corporate seals and everything." A murmur ran through the gathered townsfolk. Sarah Wheeler pressed closer, peering at the documents. So the money wasn't stolen at all. It was payment. "Looks that way," the sheriff said, taking the papers back carefully. His cousin must have hidden it away, then left clues only the dog would understand. Smart man, knowing somebody might come asking questions someday. Rufus sat back on his haunches, panting slightly, his one good eye watching the humans with what almost looked like satisfaction. Despite his injuries, his tail thumped steadily against the cave floor. "I'm riding for Carson City today," the sheriff announced, tucking the documents safely into his coat. "Judge Wilson needs to see these right away. Could change everything." For Michael, the news raced down the mountain faster than spring runoff. By sunset, the whole town knew about the discovery. Folks gathered in clusters outside the general store, the saloon, the church steps, talking in excited voices about how they'd known all along something wasn't right about the accusations. "Always said Michael seemed honest," declared Mrs. Peterson. At the quilting circle, the way he helped fix the church roof and them sacks of flour he gave the school, those weren't the actions of a thief. And that government agent, added Thomas Wheeler, awful quick to make arrests without proper investigation. Ought to be some questions asked about that. Even Hank Crowder, who'd first spread word about the strongbox, changed his tune. "Michael's good for business," he admitted in the saloon. "Brings stability to town. We need more folk like that, not less." The sheriff's horse kicked up dust as he galloped toward Carson City, the precious documents secure against his chest. Behind him, Silver Bluff hummed with new energy, as if the whole town had awakened from a troubled dream. Up in the cave, Rufus curled in his favorite spot near the entrance, nose resting on paws, keeping watch over the place that had started it all. The morning sun painted Silver Bluff's courthouse steps, golden as townspeople gathered for the circuit judge's arrival. Judge Wilson, a tall man with iron-gray hair and keen eyes, descended from his carriage with deliberate steps. His black robes billowed in the spring breeze as he made his way inside, followed by the anxious crowd. Michael stood straight back before the bench, his wrists finally free of shackles. Mary sat in the front row, her dark hair neatly braided, wearing her best calico dress. Between them, Rufus lay quietly. "Your Honor, these funds clearly belong to the United States Army. The very presence of such a sum in an abandoned cave suggests criminal intent." Judge Wilson's weathered face remained impassive as he examined the newly discovered documents. His fingers traced the railroad's official seals, comparing dates and signatures. The courtroom held its breath. These contracts, the judge stated, appear entirely legitimate. The Union Pacific Railroad legally transferred these funds to Jonathan Boone as payment for services rendered. His subsequent concealment of the money, while unusual, broke no laws. He fixed the agent with a stern gaze. The hasty arrest of his heir, Michael Boone, was premature and unwarranted. A ripple of whispers swept through the crowd. Michael's shoulders relaxed slightly, but his expression remained guarded. The battle wasn't over yet, however, the judge continued. There remains the question of the cave's rightful ownership. He gestured to Mary. The Cherokee woman has presented a claim. Let her speak. Mary rose slowly, clutching a worn leather folder. Her voice, though soft, carried clearly through the hushed room. Your Honor, this deed has passed through my husband's family for 3 generations. She opened the folder, revealing pages covered in both English script and Cherokee syllabary. Our people used this cave as sacred shelter during the hard winter of 1848. Many of our elders rest. There are several men at the back of the room snickered. The judge's gavel cracked sharply. Silence. This court will show respect to all parties, Mary continued, her chin lifted. We never abandoned our claim to this holy place. The deed was recorded properly, though some chose not to honor it. Her dark eyes met the judge's steadily. I ask only for what is right by both laws, yours and ours. Yours and ours. Judge Wilson studied the deed carefully, comparing it to county records. Minutes stretched like hours. Rufus shifted, pressing closer to Mary's skirts. Finally, the judge looked up. This deed is valid, he declared. It was properly registered, and never legally superseded. However, Michael Boone's inheritance claim, through his cousin, also stands. He surveyed the packed courtroom. Therefore, I rule that ownership of the cave shall be shared equally between Mary Whitecloud and Michael Boone, with all rights and responsibilities thereof. Regarding the strongbox, the judge's voice rang with finality. The payroll funds, having been legally transferred and inherited, are hereby restored to Michael Boone's possession. This court's decision is final. The room erupted. Cheers and applause broke out from most of the crowd, though some faces darkened with disappointment. The government agent gathered his papers with sharp movements and strode out. Sarah Wheeler hugged Mary, while Thomas Wheeler clapped Michael's shoulder. Michael turned to Mary, his weathered face softening. Without words, he extended his hand. She took it, their fingers clasping in shared relief and understanding. Rufus, despite his bandages, thumped his tail against the floor. Looking between his 2 humans with his one good eye, the morning light streamed through the courthouse windows. Touching each face with gold, the judge's satisfied nod, the supporters, joyful smiles, and most of all, the quiet gratitude shining in both Michael's and Mary's eyes as justice settled over Silver Bluff, like a gentle rain after drought. The late summer sun warmed the town square as Michael and Mary sat at her kitchen. Table, papers spread before them. Through the window, morning glory vines climbed the porch rails, their purple blooms nodding in the breeze. $5 million, Michael said softly. Still hardly believing it. Seems like more than any man needs. He pushed a stack of banknotes across the worn wood. Reckon the Lord had bigger plans than just making me rich. Mary's fingers traced the edge of an architectural drawing for the new mission school. These children need education, both Cherokee and settler alike. Knowledge builds bridges between peoples. Michael nodded, remembering how the town's children already played together, thanks to Mary's gentle influence. The school first, then, and the church needs more than just that roof repair. The farms need water most of all, Mary added. Her dark eyes met his, both sides of the creek. Together they sketched out their vision, irrigation ditches, stretching from the high springs down through both communities' fields. A new mission school built of solid pine, the old church restored to glory, with enough left over to help families through hard times. 2 weeks later, the town gathered for a feast celebrating the start of these projects. Long tables filled the square, groaning with food, settler wives' pies beside Cherokee fry bread, venison stew next to roasted chicken. Lanterns swung from ropes strung between buildings, casting warm light over the scene. Even Hank Crowder, who'd spread those first damaging rumors, came forward to shake Michael's hand. Reckon I misjudged you, he admitted gruffly. You're doing right by this town, Under the lamplit sky, children chased Rufus, their laughter rising sweet and clear. The old dog's tail wagged as he played with them, his bandages long gone. Near the food tables, Sarah Wheeler chatted with Mary about plans for teaching at the new school. Michael stood at the edge of it all, his heart full. He watched Mary move through the crowd, graceful and sure, stopping to speak with both settlers and Cherokee families. She caught his eye and smiled, and something warm bloomed in his chest. The sheriff approached, holding out a cup of coffee. "Never seen this town so united," he observed. "Seems that fortune of yours turned out to be more than just money." "Wasn't my doing," Michael replied quietly. "The Lord had his own plans, just took me a while to see them." Looking over the gathered community, former enemies now breaking bread together, children playing without care for differences, hope rising like a tide, Michael felt it deep in his bones. Here was the belonging he'd searched for all those lonely years. God hadn't just given him an inheritance of gold, he'd carved out something far more precious: a family, a purpose, and a home. The church bell pealed across Silver Bluff, its clear tones ringing through the crisp morning air. Sunlight gleamed on the fresh-painted steeple, no longer weather-worn, and leaning through the open doors, new pine pews gleamed and colorful light filtered through restored stained glass windows. Michael stood on the front steps beside Mary, feeling the warmth of her shoulder against his. His once ragged coat had been replaced by a clean Sunday best, though his hands remained work-roughened from helping with repairs. When her fingers brushed his heart swelled with quiet joy. Inside, Rufus lay curled by the pot-bellied stove, his graying muzzle resting on his paws. The old dog's remaining, I watched contentedly as families filed in, Cherokee children in their best clothes sitting beside settler youngsters, their parents following with hymnals in hand. Michael closed his eyes as the last bell tone faded. A year ago, he'd trudged into town bitter and alone, bearing nothing but wounded pride and empty pockets. Now, standing beside the woman who'd taught him to trust again, he whispered a prayer of thanks. "Lord," he murmured, "I reckon I was blind as Rufus till you showed me the way. Thank you for Mary's wisdom, for that faithful old dog, and for turning a cold cave into a place of miracles." Mary's hand found his fingers intertwining. Together, they stepped through the doorway into the light-filled sanctuary, ready to begin their new chapter of shared faith and purpose. If you believe stories can heal, lift, and connect us, this channel is for you. Thanks for being here. Hit subscribe, and I'll meet you again tomorrow with something real.